Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to tonight's special IPQ debate on defending Europe's economic security. I'm Henning Hoff, Executive Editor of Internationale Politik Quarterly. It's a first for us, a debate that takes place as an in-person event at the German Council of Foreign Relations, which is also live streamed on the topic of our current fall 2025 issue. We're doing so to mark our recent anniversary. IPQ turned 5 on the 1st of October. So allow me a few words about the latest incarnation of the English edition of Internationale Politik, Germany's leading foreign affairs magazine, which itself will be turning 80 in the coming month. IPQ feels quite young, but in fact, we launched it in a different era, or so it feels in retrospect. In October 2020, in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, Angela Merkel was still Federal Chancellor, close to completing her 15th year in office. Donald Trump was US President, but soon to be voted out of office, with many assuming his chaotic presidency would be an aberration. Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, however, had been in power for about 2 or 1 decades, respectively. The world's strongmen turned away from the rules-based order that had benefited Europe and Germany so much was already written on the wall. So, inasmuch as journalism is the first draft of history, you can read our now 21 issues, plus a special issue printed for this year's Munich Security Conference. You can read those issues as a chronicle of 5 years of upheaval for Germany and Europe, a period of time that inter alia witnesses huge shifts in the international order and saw German security policy transformed at last. I'd like to take a short moment to thank the wonderful IP team, Editor-in-Chief Martin Bielecki, Tim Hofmann, Ute Kuhlmann, Lotte Merkel, Joachim Staron, and of course, our long-standing contributors and columnists. Some of them are in the call. Special thanks to the small IPQ team, Siobhan Dowling, my co-editor, Nora Bieter-Timmins, who is working currently and looking after our social media, and our art director and designer, Thorsten Kirchhoff. As regular or even occasional readers of IPQ, you may have noticed that we have not only tried to inform the European foreign and security policy debate, we have also aimed at shaping it. We advocated in our first issue for a renewal of the transatlantic relationship and have since pushed for a new German foreign policy, for greater geostrategic thinking, for EU enlargement, for a new China policy, often ahead of the curve. The same is true for our debate tonight. It's not that another wake-up call was needed, but last week's restriction on rare earth exports on the part of China has made absolutely clear that the topic of our current issue, namely Europe's economic security, is timely indeed. To safeguard it, there needs to be a different approach, not only at the policy level, but also at the institutional level. And I'm very happy and honored to introduce our keynote speaker who will propose exactly that, Professor Luuk van Middelaar. I once had the pleasure of introducing Luuk at the DGAP before, on occasion of the publication of the German edition of The Passage to Europe, in German, Vom Kontinent zur Union. And I still vaguely remember what I said then, and say it again here. The question was who would be best placed to write about the often painful process of European integration, the inner workings of the EU as we know it today, and Europe's place in the world, now and in the future. Maybe an insider who had worked at the EU's institutions, or an academic, a historian or political scientist perhaps, finely attuned to the ebbs and flows of European history, or a journalist and commentator covering the EU and its member states on a daily basis with a keen eye for the telling detail, offering sharp comment. Well, Luuk van Middelaar has all these personas uniquely combined. Luuk studied in Paris, Groningen, and Amsterdam, where in 2009 he received his PhD in political thought. By that time, he was already an established author. His first book, Politicide, had appeared 10 years earlier and won the prestigious Prix de Paris. Also in 2009, the Dutch version of The Passage to Europe was first published. It has since been published in more than 10 languages. From 2010 to 2014, Luuk van Middelaar was chief speechwriter and advisor to European Council President Herman van Rompuy. Afterwards, he taught EU law at Leiden University and acted as a political commentator for the Dutch newspaper NRC Handelsblad. More books followed, again appearing in multiple languages, among them Alarums and Excursions, Pandemonium, and Le Réveil Géopolitique de l'Europe, all groundbreaking accounts of the European Union's crisis politics of recent years. And in 2002, he added yet another dimension to his many qualifications, the role of a think tanker as the founding director of the Brussels Institute for Geopolitics, which during the short time of its existence has already made a huge impact on the European geopolitical debate. Tonight, Luuk van Middelaar will talk about why the EU needs a European Economic Security Council, something he argues for in our current issue and also more extensively in a paper published by the Brussels Institute for Geopolitics on September the 30th. We will now hear from Luuk with his keynote, followed by a panel discussion. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And now it's over to you, Luuk. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Henning, for the kind introduction. Thank you all for being here. Very much looking forward to the conversation also with the other panelists, Oliver, Katharina, and Filip, and with all of you in the room. And I'm sure indeed that the sense of urgency, which Henning also was alluding to concerning the topic of geoeconomic and how to deal with new dilemmas and trade-offs resonates. And at the Brussels Institute for Geopolitics, we have indeed put forward one proposal, and there can be others, to say that Europe needs an Economic Security Council. But first I want to explain why, because I think it's important to get something of a shared understanding of a diagnosis, and then say a few words about what such a council could look like. I think the premise that brings us together is that in today's geoeconomic age, shaped by Xi, Putin, and Trump, markets, technology, critical raw materials have become battlegrounds of power. Trade today is as much a weapon of war as it is a path towards peace and prosperity. And that, of course, has a huge impact on everyday decision-making in the public sector, also in the private sector, because nearly every economic decision by states today carries strategic weight. So be it, fossil fuel imports, trade agreements, electric vehicle subsidies, or rare earth needs. Now, somewhat reluctantly, this reality is also being acknowledged in Brussels policy-making circles. That's, as you have understood, where I am based. And I think recent events have kind of catalyzed this awareness. Of course, in the past summer, the EU accepted asymmetric US tariffs, Trump administration, clearly not just as a price for maintaining access to American markets, but also for keeping Washington engaged in Ukraine and in NATO. So it was, if I exaggerate a little bit, a security decision disguised as trade policy, or perhaps closer to the mark, it was trade and security at the same time, but very, very hard to disentangle the two. And in such high-stakes moments, there are all kinds of strategic questions that one can ask, and can also be topic for debate, but there are also institutional questions to be asked, and that is who speaks, who decides, who acts, who carries the voice of Europe at such a moment, who makes the final call. In this case, of course, there was a leading role for the Commission President, and not least on the grounds of the Commission's role in trade policy. But in hindsight, I think maybe there would have been something to be said for a more visible interplay between the European Commission and the national leaders, as it was also about security. It would have maybe been less uncomfortable for von der Leyen once some critique started to be voiced. In any case, leaving this episode aside, because there are many, many others, and there are many, many to come, no doubt, the integration of trade and statecraft is reshaping European governance all across the continent. Of course, in Berlin, I think at the end of the summer, the National Security Council, the Nationale Sicherheitsrat, has been established at the Federal Chancellery, and I'd be happy to hear from those of you in the room how that is going. But it is, I think, born out of the same need to integrate more closely these various dimensions. But at the EU level, institutions, I would say, that's the diagnosis, remain structurally ill-equipped for this new reality. Because we have very siloed institutions, in Brussels perhaps even more so than in Berlin, a reliance on law and rules and depoliticizing instincts, which all worked very well in the previous globalization era, but they leave Europe unprepared for today's starker realities. And we think that doing nothing would be irresponsible. Now, of course, we can look at economic statecraft or the art of using economic tools to further foreign policy and security goals. It is not completely new, and the EU is already doing it, for instance, with sanctions policy and think about Russia. But the way to look at it today is much broader, because now it affects almost any economic policy. And since the European Union has been endowed with major economic competences over the course of time, if you want to use that source of economic power, for strategic ends, that unavoidably requires EU policy making and coordinated political leadership, unless you want to undo what has been decided in terms of transfer of competences. But if we fail to adapt to these new realities, I think two problems could follow. And the first, and we have a lot of analysis in the IPQ essay and also in the long report, without adaptation, first issue is that EU institutions designed to regulate markets, basically at heart, will by default begin shaping foreign policy, often unintentionally. If I take one example, the enforcement of the Digital Services Act, piece of legislation which makes policymakers very proud to act, for instance, against US platforms. Now, in normal days, that might seem like a routine regulatory issue. But in the current period, it can carry very heavy geopolitical implications that could easily strain transatlantic ties, even now that Elon Musk has left the White House. It is still not an anodyne method to decide whether X does or does not transgress EU rules, something, for instance, which Vice President J.D. Vance also cares deeply about. Now, it is obvious that that kind of decisions are too important to be left to mid-level Commission officials in DG Connect, as it is called in Brussels, with all due respect. There are many other examples. You could also mention, for instance, deforestation regulation, which is a very laudable objective by Europe to protect the rainforests across the world. But putting that policy forward in a kind of siloed approach without taking into account the reactions and the implications of Europe's partners was perhaps not so prudent, because as a result, with dozens of countries, including G20 members, it resulted in a backlash against that legislation. You could still decide to do it, but at least it would be good to know in advance that there is also a political, geopolitical price to pay. So it is about identifying the dilemmas and not proceeding in a siloed approach. Now, the second problem has to do, or the second risk, with legitimacy. The Commission, which in many cases is in the lead for these issues, derives its authority mainly from its neutrality and technical expertise. There can be other views about it, and I also see former members of the European Parliament, but for many of these issues, especially the market regulations, it's for the Commission being neutral and technical. Now, once the Commission starts making geopolitical trade-offs, balancing relations between the US and China, that narrative no longer holds, it collapses. To take the example I just mentioned, if enforcement decisions risk provoking US threats to NATO, that story doesn't hold anymore. Now, these are some thoughts about the diagnosis. Having laid that out, what's our proposal? That is a European Economic Security Council, which indeed we presented in the IPQ issue, and at the same day in a kind of longer version in our printed report at our institute. And I co-authored it with my colleague Hans Kribbe. To be clear, it is not a reinvention of the wheel, and others have put forward maybe similar proposals, but it is a way to make it better spin. For us, it was clear from the start what the three criteria should be to make this work. First, any institutional body dealing with economic security should be cross-silo. It should be horizontal. It should be able to link the spheres of the economy and trade on the one hand and security and diplomacy on the other. That's one. Secondly, it should have a link to the highest political authority. And in the European Union, that is the European Council, which gathers 27 national leaders plus the Commission President, and can take these kind of far-reaching decisions. Thirdly, there should be a form of institutional and administrative follow-up to what this body decides. The whole thing is loosely modeled on the National Security Council in Washington, the NSC. And in the context of the EU, we see it as a bit like the NSC in Washington, as a body with three levels. At the top level, it's the 27 heads of state of government from the member states, plus the president of the Commission, and also of other institutional bodies like the European Investment Bank or the European Central Bank and the Eurogroup, and the High Representative, of course. Below that, at the second level, 27 ambassadors plus the same representatives of EU bodies. Now, and that's in a way, that's nothing new. That's just reassembling existing pieces on the board, the European Council and COREPER with little changes. Now, the real innovation we propose is more at the working level, third level, and that is to say, well, there should be 27 national economic security coordinators assessing the geostrategic implications of EU proposals early on. Examples, as I just mentioned, deforestation, digital currency, or trade, or preventing them, as it were, to getting lost in the great soup of Brussels policymaking, where sometimes nobody knows what's really happening where. Now, and that forum would have to be steered by an EU economic security advisor appointed by the European Council, a little bit also like the National Security Advisor in Washington. This advisor would lead a task force of experts responsible for foresight, risk analysis, and contingency planning. And that person would be really on the front line, injecting urgency and connect the issue to the European Council. A little bit how Michel Barnier, during the UK divorce proceedings, became Mr. Brexit, embodying the topic. That's in very simple terms what the proposal is. So injection of urgency with a dedicated person, a task force, and then making sure that some of these decisions go up. Now, of course, there's a resistance to renewal in any system, and that is that in the EU there's no exception. And I think it is fair to say that it can expect resistance to come from two sources. On the one hand, among member states, let's not forget, where many are wary of a Brussels power grab, skepticism over the EU taking a stronger role in economic statecraft remains. And that is also true for member states who can be very committed in certain respects. However, as the European Union's legal economic competences increasingly shape security and will continue to do more and more, having some strategic guidance to them is inevitable. So member states will have to make up their minds. Either allow unaccountable Brussels officials to make hidden geopolitical decisions while hoping their capital is among the few still getting phone calls from what locally is called the 13th floor of the Berlaymont building, where the Commission President works and lives. Or create a forum, as we propose, where trade-offs are openly debated and judged by elected leaders. So there will be resistance on the side of member states. Brussels policy-making circles may also tend to resist any such innovation. I think the Commission has been quietly accumulating power in the foreign policy domain, including at the expense of the European External Action Service, and concerns may well be raised over overcomplication or things like that. But in our view, the real danger is the opposite. It's to continue with strategic confusion and political drift. We think the challenge to secure Europe's economic security is real and urgent. And without change, the continent will remain vulnerable to stronger powers willing to decide its future. Not just maybe Russia, but also China, and who knows, the US. So we can't do nothing. And this proposal is just but one piece of a big, much larger puzzle to harness Europe's economic power to the benefit of our security. Let me stop here by way of kickoff. I'm very much looking forward to our exchange. Thank you so much.
Please have a seat. I also would like to welcome the rest of the panel. We have with us Oliver Rentschler, Director General for Geoeconomics, the German Foreign Office. Mr. Rentschler, please. We also have with us Katharina Neckel, Director Law of International Trade and Trade Facilitation, German Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And last but not least, Filip Medunić, my DGAP Research Fellow here at the Center for Geopolitics, Geoeconomics and Technology. Welcome to you all. I would like to start by asking each of you for a quick response to the idea Luuk has just sort of developed. Is this something, Mr. Rentschler, which the Chancellor might take to the upcoming European Council and push for it?
Thank you. First of all, I should say that, of course, there is no government position on this proposal, and whatever I say, it's just a personal observation. Second, I'm not sure I can be quick because it's really an elaborate proposal, but one that I would say is probably, I mean, we agree on the diagnosis. There is a need to act in a joined-up manner, in a coherent way, in an integrated way. But I think if you say, you know, the setup so far served us well, it's only now that we need to overcome the silos. I would say we've recognized a long time ago that we need to overcome silos, and we had a very specific, let's say, institution created at one point because we saw that we're punching below our weight by having too much separations. And that is when we created the position of the High Representative and Vice President. And I think that would be a completely different discussion the whole evening, whether and how that worked and why it didn't. But I think that same discussion would have to be had here because my, let's say, basic assessment is that you need to have let's say, access to the instruments of the Commission, and you need to have access to what member states have, which is the Council. So you need to have basically a position equaling to some degree the HRVP, which sits in both. Because if you sit in one or the other, you will run into a whole range of problems. We can discuss them maybe later. My bottom line, as I've been asked to be brief in this first round, is really it's not about structures, it's about mindset, it's about using the current instruments in a proper way to maybe incrementally work on those instruments. I would also say, for example, just because you said, and I've witnessed it myself in Brussels in many functions, that indeed some technocratic Commission decisions, justified as they may have been, have really caused diplomatic damage. I remember even before deforestation and others traveling with the then HRVP, because I was in the cabinet of two HRVPs, having a third country trip planned for a long time. We arrive at the airport. The first thing we hear is that we get a lot of protest about blacklisting of that country under the money laundering, something that the Commission has, for good reasons, decided at a low level, which blew up our whole visit. That kind of, let's say, problem needs to be overcome, but there would be, in my way, conviction, ways to overcome it. For example, just a practical thing, to have a systematic foreign policy impact analysis for everything or anything rather that the Commission proposes. We have it for other issues, but this could be one way. So before you put something on the table, make that foreign policy impact analysis, and that would already be one step. I have other thoughts when it comes to, for example, using the council formations, make jumbos. We have it for foreign and defense ministers. We should have it foreign and technology ministers, foreign and energy ministers. That would be another way of using the system as it is, while keeping a bit the structures. As a quick response, that's my take, but happy to discuss it further.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Katharina, you sort of coming from a sort of trade organization representing businesses. So what is your take of this proposal?
Thank you. So I think that Luuk said something that was also written in his paper, but I think he also mentioned it now, a very important point, that every economic decision now carries strategic weight. And I think there could be nothing that is truer at the moment. We're seeing every day when we open the papers, might it be, the Chinese export controls, might it be tariffs, or the new BIS 50% rule. All of these things are increasingly becoming also economic policy, security policy. And two things I think that struck with me. First of all, because it's economic decisions, I think businesses and industries, they really have to be taken into account from the very first moment. And the second thing is that by creating a new institution, what we really need to be mindful about is also creating a new layer of bureaucratic burdens. So, and I know this is not a comparison one-on-one, but when I was reading this, I was also sometimes thinking about Russia sanctions and the EU sanctions that we're having. And when deciding Russian sanctions, this is something, that happens between the 27 member states, and you have to decide unanimously. And we all know that this is sometimes harder than we maybe would like to admit. And it's, it has geopolitical different interests and shifts, and trying to actually find not the most smallest common denominator, but going for a big step and a big leap sometimes seems hard. And what I think is most important is looking at, regulations and decisions that actually can work in practice, because what we have to keep in mind is that every decision being made right now is actually something where the realities and consequences are actually being borne by industry, being borne by businesses. So, for instance, let's say the No Russia clause was something that came up in the EU sanctions regimes, which is basically a re-export clause that was kind of established to prevent sanction circumvention, which is in itself a goal that we can all get behind on, I think. It was just the way that it was made up, that it tied huge economic and business capacities where it was not really evident if this was actually a tool that was going to work. And I think this is something that should not happen when coming to such an important matter as economic security, and to really avoid something and to avoid decisions being made more from like the ivory tower down to businesses. I think it's really important to actually now include businesses and industries really from the first moment, because it's so imperative from our point of view. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Filip, please come in as well as with your first thoughts on the proposal.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I have to say I really welcome the proposal. I think this is a great idea and a really great kind of thought through concept of how we could think and conceive this issue of bringing together these different spheres. And I'm not saying this only because I think about a piece that I wrote with a colleague of mine last year, Tobias Gerke from ECFR. And back then we were arguing for like a geoeconomic council formation taking place twice a year or something. But there was the time of Joe Biden still, and this was the time where we were still thinking that we could somehow manage in geoeconomic world, but we're already seeing on the horizon what is coming. And now, 15 months later, I think it's absolutely evident that we need more space for coordination. And I really welcome also the points that have been made by my by the previous speakers about the mindset and about how economic decisions are also strategic today. I would like to maybe add 2 points and a consideration. Those 2 points, I think they're just kind of a reinforcement about the need to think about new ways of conceiving economic security and geoeconomic thinking. And one is agility, and the second one is simultaneity. They don't sound very sexy, but what I mean by this is the first one is what we're seeing now with the current administration in the United States, which is very kind of erratic, only giving a vague trend of where it is going. And at the same time, we also see China, which is gearing up in response to that and also acting very on an almost day-to-day or week-to-week basis. We see this kind of very quick shifts in policy, and this world is constantly evolving, but we're in a governance system which is made for rules that don't change once they're agreed. And this is not the world that we live in anymore. And the second one, simultaneity, in the lack of a better word for it, I mean by this, we're facing different policy issues that we have to tackle at the same time, be it on rare earths, on trade, or strategic industries. We can't take them chronologically step by step, but we have to think them through. On rare earths, for example, what does it mean in the short term, in the medium, and in the long term? But we have to start now for all of the 3 time horizons. And so I think this is just 2 points why they're also, which should reinforce the need of thinking for new structures. The last point that I wanted to just mention is a kind of consideration. One of the essays in the current issue, was written by a very dear colleague, Francesca Guiretti, about that today's geoeconomic world is seeing also economic statecraft, and we're still thinking a lot about economic security. Statecraft is kind of the offensive way of using economic tools in foreign policy. And I think this is exactly also a reason why we need a place where this can be discussed, to calibrate it, to discuss issues like you've mentioned about the sanctions regime. So I really welcome that proposal and think this is a very good basis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So to sum up, maybe it's 1 against, 1 for, and 1 maybe in the middle. Luuk, what sort of what would be your response to maybe to the point Oliver Rentschler made, sort of saying, well, we have everything in place. It's just sort of the way of using the tools we have and the procedures.
No, I think the important thing is, and I thank the panelists for engaging so deeply with the proposal, is that there seems to be an understanding that there is a problem and that we share more or less the analysis, and that indeed then the question is what to do about it. I think the point Oliver made, or the 2 most important points. One is that we don't need that. This has already been tried, and of course, in the, let's say in the long version, we mention quickly also the whole idea of the EAS was precisely to bridge the economic legal sphere with the security and diplomatic dimension, because already 20 years ago, when the treaty was drafted, of course, there were these connections, even if they were at that time not what drove the everyday foreign policy community, which was all about Iraq and Afghanistan, but still it was clear that these connections had to be made. So the decision then was, okay, we bring the security dimension into the Commission with the HRVP. And I would say, well, let's be realistic, and it's sad to conclude, but this has been tried and it hasn't worked. It's 15 years later. I was there in 2010 working for Van Rompuy, the days of Ashton, when the EAS was set up. Excellent idea on paper, and for reasons which go beyond this panel, it hasn't worked out. So we have to try something else. And what you propose as to compensate for the weakness is a foreign policy analysis of Commission proposals. I think that's exactly right, and that's also what, in a way, what we suggest that the task force and the national, the economic security advisor would do. But in this case, the question is, where do you situate such a body? And I think that at heart, the European Commission, for all its brilliant staff, is not a body which has precisely the strategic mindset and the strategic culture to reflect about these issues. It is at heart a regulatory institution. It is filled with the best legal minds, economic minds. That's what brings them. And let's say the tradition of strategic thinking, historic thinking, diplomacy is not at all represented there, and you cannot kind of bring it in. Not to mention the other element of, let's say, legitimacy. A lot of these decisions, which are about our positioning as Europeans in the evolving great power landscape in between China and the US, they also are really more and more entering the fray of national politics, of national electorates. Even elections are being fought on these issues also in, let's say, more in Central and Eastern Europe, but it may also come that way in Western Europe as well, on whether you are on the side of Russia or Brussels, or so you cannot take that out and situated within the Commission, which is protected from these considerations. So that's why we try to say, okay, let's put it on the other side. Let's see. But I agree 100%. If the Commission doesn't want to play a game on this, that it won't work. It won't work. But the interesting thing about the European Council, and we mentioned not the Council, this is really for the experts, but not the Council, but the European Council as the key body, because it's the leaders, but also because the President of the European Commission is a full member of the European Council. So in a way, the integration of the security and the market dimension has been there from the beginning of that body, and that's why we use it as the anchor for the underlying structure. And for the other panelists, I would just wholeheartedly endorse what they have said. The interplay between private and public actors, the business perspective, will also be more and more important as we enter further into the age of geoeconomics, because there is also a public policy dimension to many decisions by private actors. Yeah.
Yes, please. If you want to respond to
I would
to that, and then we move on.
But thanks for this opportunity, indeed, because I would want to ask basically because we have to make test cases, kind of what would have been different. The two biggest items we all know, it's of course the challenge of the US trade tariff policy, and the other is China. But take the example of I don't call it a deal because it was really asymmetric. It was the result of economic coercion. But it's still, in my conviction, the best possible outcome. It's not a good one, but it's the least bad one. And it contains, indeed, trade policy issues combined with two other items that are basically the realm of council, meaning member states, which is investment and energy purchases. That deal came together, yes, not in a kind of very structured way, but it's still combining the two elements. And I would just take this example, wonder, how could it have worked differently? Because, of course, the European Council, there's also no contesting, is the ultimate, let's say, institution when it comes to those issues. The members of the European Council, it's not always possible to have emergency meetings of that council, but we have to make these kind of test cases. And the other comment still on the Commission being a regulatory body, yes, true. But ever since the Geopolitical Commission started with the first von der Leyen, there is, of course, the ambition to be much more. And it is true when it comes to new trade agreements. That's not only about regulating, that's really opening, diversifying. If you want to diversify, which is one of the answers to our challenge, then you need a complete toolbox of what the Commission has to offer, not only market access, but also cooperation in science and agriculture. And I think I can't see any scenario in which the Commission would, let's say, happily cooperate with someone sitting in the Council. But that's just let's say, experience of more than 10 years working in around the Rond-Point and Schuman, but to be discussed, of course.
Thanks so much. Would you like to respond immediately, or shall we move on? What it's a counterfactual now, but would have made.
Well, on the first point, I think you have to make a distinction between the outcome of the EU-US trade deal and the process. And I agree with Oliver on the outcome. Maybe if the negotiations had been organized in a different way, the outcome would have been the same. I don't contest that. But on this example, I think the problem was also with the process. President von der Leyen claimed also publicly that it was a trade negotiation, that the decision was taken only on those grounds. She backpedaled a little bit, but she came, even in the European Parliament, she stayed very close to that line. It's just not a credible position, because people know that it was also about security. And she became also in a very uncomfortable decision once it became clear, at least according to some opinion polls, that more than half of the Germans and half of the French public thought it was a humiliating deal, and that but of course you can ask anything you want, but that she would have to resign. Had the decision been taken in a more visible manner, had she had the overt physical backing of the European Council, would have been more sound, I would say, and also better vis-a-vis public opinion, rather than the system which we now have. And not all of you, of course, are maybe familiar with how these things go. A few phone calls between President von der Leyen's chief of staff and a handful of EU ambassadors or advisors. And that's just not good enough for such an important decision. So I would contest it on the ground of process. And for other examples, as we discussed, and you mentioned yourself, there's just diplomatic damage if we continue for these, let's say, less salient topics to treat them in a kind of under the radar manner until they explode. And there we need, one way or another, this kind of foreign policy assessment.
Thank you very much, Luuk. I would like to move it on a little bit and sort of focus on Germany's role for a moment. As we read in the press, or sort of, I think it was also open, sort of not a secret that Chancellor Merz sort of pushed for the line to make a deal with the Trump administration and to get that out of the way. Maybe start with Filip this time. You've been working quite a lot on the German economic security strategy. Where do you think is the Merz government at the moment, and sort of how urgent a task do they see this whole question?
So maybe I would have to start by saying, if I would know where it exactly stands with the national German economic security strategy, I would probably not be able to say it here, but I don't know exactly where the government stands at the moment. But joking aside, I think it is a very good endeavor that we're undertaking, which is a quite new one. To write a strategy on economic security was a little bit, yeah, I could say something new in the beginning when I saw this in the beginning of the year, also coming up in the election campaign. But I want to make a couple of quick points, maybe why I think this is important and how it can actually help also on European level. And first one is by starting off to also look at something very similar that you're describing on the European level, the governance structure in Germany, which is basically made for compromise, for coalition building, for exactly not having a single powerful leadership as maybe in other countries that we're seeing, which are implementing geoeconomic policies in a wider sense. So this is something we have in our structures, which is very positive, but on cross-cutting issues, which economic security, for example, touches upon so much, it makes it a bit complicated sometimes. So I think a national strategy can therefore be kind of a very good first step of advancing such a thinking on what policy objectives actually should be pursued by economic security. Because when we look back at the economic security strategy of the European Union, it was very risk-based. It was very much drawing on the notion of what are the risks, the threats that we're facing, in which domains. So I think it's a very important next step to say, okay, what is actually the objective that we want to reach by kind of tackling those risks and also combining them with the other pillars that have been mentioned in the economic security strategy of the European Union, which is promote and partner. So I think this would be something very positive. I argue for doing this in kind of missions and action plans in the current issue. But I think it can actually help also to support the European level, because national strategic thinking, I believe, is important to also further such a European Economic Security Council and to give entry points for member states. Because if you don't have your own strategy made up or your own trade-offs, which are essentially at the core of economic security problems, and how you want to resolve those trade-offs or what you are willing to invest to overcome trade-offs between economic interests and security interests, then it also lacks, I think, powerful voices at the European level. I maybe leave it here because of many more points I could make, but I don't want to eat too much into the time.
Yeah, we come back to that, I'm sure. Katharina, Neckel, sort of, where are the German businesses are sort of positioned in this debate? Sort of, the government is drawing up a strategy. You already in your first contribution already pointed out that it makes a lot of sense to involve those whose sort of operations is actually deeply affected by these kind of decisions. Sort of, what is your impression of this process of on the national level at the moment?
Well, you asked where are the businesses, and I would say right in the middle of it, and at some point. So what we're seeing really is, businesses being at the very heart of economic statecraft. So looking at tariffs, looking at sanctions, looking at export controls. And of course, there's always the willingness trying to adapt fast. So how would I do that? Through changing supply chains and looking for how to mitigate risks at the best possible way, finding new markets, doing that, and also I think what is very important here is looking at new trade agreements, talking about Mercosur, India especially, all of those focusing on really trying to mitigate risks and finding new markets and strengthening a resilience there. I think we also sometimes maybe forget we do have hidden champions, especially in Germany. We have a lot of SMEs that are really at the core and backbone of the EU, looking at quantum, looking at semiconductors. So also looking there and protecting that and trying to stay competitive with that. And I'm not saying this, just because we want a prosperous economy, but because a prosperous economy is also really looking at, the technology and trade war between China and US. Prosperous economy really also can manage as a leverage, as a bargaining point. So I think that is a very important tool to keep in mind. So I think there's kind of leaning on also the EU economic security strategy, also kind of 3 steps that are very important, and one is clarity. So trying to find stable rules, to find predictable rules when it comes to export controls, when it comes to foreign direct investment screening rules, but also proportionality. So really looking at where actually are my risks, looking at what are the high risks and trying to find those high risks and not putting out, blanket measures through managed trade, but really trying to go for pinpointing these risks that we're looking at. Also, of course, harmonization is something that is always talked about, and is something that is important not only at EU level but also with like-minded partners, G7, may that be UK, etc. But then again, also when talking about harmonization, just from a purely business standpoint, there's always the word gold plating coming to mind that Germany is sometimes being accused of when we say we're all jumping this high, Germany's businesses should jump a meter higher. So I think these are something to keep into account. And I think the last thing, which I think Filip also touched base upon, is partnership and trying to find the dialogue between policymakers and stakeholders and businesses, but also looking for, like I said, trade agreements, etc. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Oliver Rentschler, the very fact that your position exists already means that geoeconomics is something which has sort of arrived at the German Foreign Office. Do you think, in the wake of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there was a shock to Germany? It has sort of relied on Russia to a dangerous extent. Do you think this has really been overcome in all its aspects, or is there still sort of well, is there still some way to go to really sort of, so you said mindset in your first contributions. Is there a mindset now established in Berlin where economic security is really sort of one of the first considerations?
I would say, in principle, yes, there is an issue about still speed and really sense of urgency, but the general notion that economic security matters, and it does require also at the national level really integrating different elements, the domestic, the external, also various line ministries. That's indeed reflected by also the coalition agreement with this tasking of the economic security strategy. I would, however, also claim that we already have one. If you look at the China strategy, it is an economic security strategy in all but name. And if you look at the genesis of it, it also shows you that after the full-scale invasion, we had a tasker already in the last coalition to come up with a national security strategy. That task was then, of course, executed only after. So we had a clear sense of those vulnerabilities that you refer to. And if you look at the 3 pillars, so to speak, of this national security strategy, it was really the Wehrhaftigkeit, so the classic territorial defense. Second was resilience. Third was sustainability. And in the resilience, everything is already there. And the China strategy was basically a sub-strategy. So I think we had a China strategy at roughly the same time that the joint communication came out on the European economic security. I think this was a gradual approach. I think still more needs to be done when it comes to getting from the analysis to the action, reviewing the toolbox. I've seen myself, because I was in this position, that yes, we have added to the toolbox. Many of the elements came from Brussels, looking at the anti-coercion instrument and the like, and we've adapted our implementation of these tools. If you look at what happened in investment screening, which always existed, but how we sharpened our lens on that, I think there's a clear direction of travel here. But more needs to be done, and I think that's now becoming clear, particularly take this China rare earth example that you mentioned. Time here is really of the essence, because you ask, are we in a better position now? I still remember the figures that we had, for relying on Russia for 40% of our energy imports. When you look at the dependency on China when it comes to rare earths, it's way above that. And it affects the energy transition. It affects our security and defense industry. So I think there's really a need to act as if this could, and it could be cut off almost at any time. And I think that's where we need to still sharpen our toolbox. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I would like to open the debate in a moment. Just give Luuk one moment to reflect on the German role. What was expected of Germany in Brussels? If you take this perspective, is there sort of something like is Germany key to this next big step which you describe, for instance, or what's the view of where the German debate stands? And after that, I would very much like to encourage you all to get in with questions here in the room. Luuk, please.
Of course, it's very important. Germany grappling with this issue as well, getting its strategic priorities right, or trying to define them and assuming trade-offs. And obviously people, let's say in Brussels, but also in other EU capitals, in Paris, Rome, Warsaw, and The Hague, they are also watching what Berlin is doing because of the economic and political weight of Germany, for one thing, but also because any, let's say, more coherent or powerful European security and economic security in particular doctrine can only come about from the interplay with what is done by national governments individually and by them together with the institutions in Brussels. And the other thing that strikes me there that also in the, let's say, the German discussions, there's a lot of discussion, debate and decisions about the toolbox, about the things we can now do, and we have policymakers have things to play with, foreign direct investment screening, and so on. But sometimes it seems more complicated, and that's also true in the EU, and I guess also in Berlin, to agree on the compass, on the strategic direction, on where actually do we want to go vis-a-vis China or vis-a-vis the United States. For Russia, it seems easier. And so I think it is important to also have that conversation, not focus on the economic security toolbox, but also on what are actually our underlying shared interests at stake, and how can we articulate that? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now's the time for your question and comments. We have a microphone going round, so make yourself known to our colleagues here. And there's one question by Luuk Johnson, an IPQ contributor. And apologies to those who are watching. Unfortunately, we can't take your questions on this occasion, but next time we do this hybrid format, we certainly will. So, Luuk, please.
Sure. Hi, I'm Luuk Johnson. I'm an IPQ contributor and journalist. My questions are to Luuk or any of the other panelists about would this economic security body have, be able to strategically communicate and have legitimacy? Because it seems to me, I agree with you that at least half the problem over the summer with the US deal was that it looked sort of like a last minute surrender, even though the outcome might have been the same had there been more of a thorough policy process. And then, with the legitimacy thing, would European would this body be able to be, effectively advocating on behalf of the European public? I mean, I'm thinking of the example of Canada. Canada was, at least in initial stages, able to stand up to the US on tariffs. They've backtracked somewhat on their digital services tax. But, there's very strong public opinion, and they had leaders who were able to communicate why they were retaliating. And the European Union doesn't seem to have... those things seem to be much more tenuous in the EU, the link between public opinion and decision-making, as well as communication. So, thanks.
Thank you very much. Maybe we take one more. This Jake, also a contributor to the cover section, actually, on the important pillar of the UK and the EU.
Yes, but I'm not going to ask about the UK. Don't worry. So thanks very much for the discussions and the keynote. Very interesting. On the Economic Security Council idea, surely the counter-argument against this is that in a time of crisis or crises where we have multiple political divisions, not least on economic security, where we have a huge collective action problem, limited political bandwidth, the last thing we should engage with at this stage is the complicated process of institution building, which would take years to negotiate, years to work out, years to get the processes in place, more teething problems and so forth. Isn't that a sort of counterintuitive thing to do? So my question would be, are you getting those reactions from practitioners, and what would your response be to that objection? Thank you.
It's a good follow-up on the previous two questions. Maria Shagin, International Institute for Strategic Studies. To play the devil's advocate and sort of following up on the previous questions, how much does the new bureaucratic agencies will solve the more fundamental issue, which is information management and sourcing of economic intelligence? Because if we look at other models across other countries, the UK, Australia didn't go for creating a new agency. They decided that cross-governmental coordination is enough. I would see the purpose for creating one agency, but ultimately the issue is, as was mentioned, legitimacy, trust, and whether the businesses are engaged and are willing to share this information. And the second question, very quickly, as someone who worked on Russian sanctions, I'm surprised to hear a lot of sanctions being featured into the economic security debate, because neither the European nor German versions feature that. What does the panel think of including sanctions into this toolbox? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Luuk, you want to start, and then we go through the panel.
Yeah, thank you for these questions. So maybe just a few clarifying remarks about the status of this new body. It's perhaps lighter than you imagined. Huh? So to start with, I think Jake was your name, right? What we envisaged is not something which would require a whole kind of treaty change operation and a new institution which would go in the list of the council, the parliament, and the court. No, it is in a way a political body, and the essence of the change of appointing an economic security advisor, establishing a task force, and a little bit rearrange maybe the meetings of ambassadors and leaders, that can be decided very quickly. I mentioned the precedent of the Brexit task force when the UK left. That was, by the way, the Commission put together a task force, appointed a very senior politician, Michel Barnier, who also worked very close together with leaders. So that can work like that. And it's also, in a way, an answer to the first question by Mr. Johnson. This body is at the support of executive power, like the National Security Council in Washington. It is not itself directly accountable to the public, but it should be there to make sure that the decisions that are taken are more closely connected to elected leaders, national leaders. And in that way, it would enhance, let's say, the democratic legitimacy, but it is itself more of a supportive body, an agency. It could be headed by somebody like Michel Barnier, who's a politician, but it would, in the way we describe it, it would rather be a senior diplomat or doing it. So we don't expect wonders. It is a relatively modest proposal, but it is a minimum to inject a dedicated place of responsibility for this issue, to get this conversation, also as other panelists managed, to get different spheres around the table in a new place. Just one word on the information management. That, in a way, that should be part of the mission of the task force as well. But you're right that a lot needs to be done there to be up to standards. And I'll leave the Russia sanction questions to the colleague.
Thank you very much. Who else wants to come in? Yes.
I mean, just to get back, at least for me, when I'm talking about sanctions and Russia sanctions, why I'm saying that is because one form of sanctions is export controls. And so export controls is one pillar of economic security. Yes, I mean, maybe for the information management side, we do see that there is a big hesitancy from the business side to actually share some information, just because we don't know, or businesses don't know what is being done with that. How is this going to maybe get back at me? So there is a hesitancy. Yes, and maybe also to play a little bit of the devil's advocate and pointing this out, well aware that there's not really a solution that I can offer, but one role model that is sometimes being mentioned when talking about resilience and economic security is Japan. But I think what we do have to keep in mind is that building that resilience took up, I think, to like 15 years. So this is not something that the EU can achieve overnight. And I think a colleague of mine recently told me that from like location to mining rare earth takes about 15 to 18 years, which blew my mind. But I think this is something that we have to speak about, that this is a reality, and that certain aspects cannot be achieved overnight. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Filip?
Yeah, also briefly, because just adding, I mean, really no issue here with this. We need to work across silos, and I think it should start within the Commission, by the way. It's this famous EXCO. I was also part of that exercise, needs to really do its job, which it doesn't always do. We have such a thing as a group of RELEX commissioners. We could have a group of economic security commissioners, to take the trade, of course, HRVP, some others. I think that would be a first step. And then when you come and bring it to the Council, because the question was also about how quickly can we act and how executive, so to speak, can we be. And I think it's in your paper, you didn't explicitly mention it, but COREPER is the working body, the working muscle that needs to fulfill that role and does it on a weekly basis. I think in your proposal it says, yes, that's indeed under the European Council, the inevitable intermediate step, but which should be chaired by the new advisor rather than by the. Okay, it's a detail. I think it's not solving the problem of the bandwidth. The COREPER has a lot on its table already. Okay, open to that kind of thinking, but the general idea, or let's say the general challenge will always be, we are the European Union, we have 27 member states, we need to have an buy-in by all, will always be a bit more complicated, but I think so far, also the recent experience with the US, I think it wasn't so bad. However, and this is the issue about the information also, there's an issue of confidentiality. And I think there's a limit also to, when it comes to communication in issues. I mean, economic security is by definition a very sensitive issue. So there's also another problem which we need to address. I am now present what you do with that in terms of how to make sure that we have, and when it comes to the trade agreement, whatever it was, there was a lot of secrecy around it, which you say, there were some phone calls here and there. It wasn't really so integrative and so on, but it has reasons. And I think we need to also address that when it comes to economic security. And on sanctions, because I'm also at the sanctions envoy, so to speak, of the Foreign Office. I think it's true. Here again, we need to see all the different aspects. It's as such as a CFSP tool, sanctions, if you look at what the objectives are, but it draws on the community, the internal market. And here again, it needs to be an integrated approach to these kind of questions across the whole cycle. And here we need to get better too. Yes.
Thanks so much. Filip, or shall we?
Maybe 2 quick points. Just on the sanctions point, I think, yes, theoretically, absolutely clear. This is kind of 2 different dimensions, but then the subjects which have to enact those sanctions, which are the businesses in the end, and I'm not speaking here for the businesses, but they are not in this kind of conceptual mode that we are in, and they might have questions about applicability, and they, in the end, are the assets that we are kind of taking in for economic security purposes. And I think this is something important we shouldn't be forgetting, which is kind of getting into the second aspect about economic intelligence, essentially, that you mentioned, where you, Katharina, brought the example of Japan. This is essentially a question about trust on the one hand, and on the other hand about making use of the resources that one already has. Because I think there is a question about who is asking the question about certain kind of information. The German government, also the EU, has a lot of data already, but it's a little bit scattered around. And there's always an issue about who's bringing this together, especially in the sense of who's asking for what information, for what purpose. So I think this is a question which has to be overcome at a kind of conceptual political level, because it takes time to build up this trust. but it cannot work only if it is kind of in a fragmented way. Maybe, yeah, so much.
All right, thank you very much. Any more questions? Please, gentleman here, and then there.
Yeah, Mr. van Middelaar, you explained kind of the bouillabaisse of decision-making in Brussels with major powers in foreign security policy vesting in the Council rather than the Commission, and the Council being kind of more powerful, but then less transparent, less visible. Now, for the Commission itself, the Commission is already trying to be a geopolitical commission, and I think we now have 5 commissioners in charge of security. We have Executive Vice President Séjourné in charge of the Raw Materials Act. We have Commissioner Kubilius in charge of defense. We have Executive Vice President Vilkunen in charge of cybersecurity, home security. And then, of course, the Trade Commissioner, Šefčovič, in charge of economic security. And to add to all of that, there's obviously High Representative Kallas. In a way, the boss of Kubilius, but it's never really clear who's calling the shots. So there are already 5 commissioners in charge. It's very difficult for the newspaper reader to know who's doing what, probably even difficult for you or even for someone who's even much closer. So if that's the result of the commission already wanting to be a geopolitical commission, how would then your new body, which would then be something the member states would still have to warm up to, which the international community would have to accept, how should that body be more successful than the perhaps not ideal constellation we currently have with 5 people in charge of security?
Thank you very much. Could you just identify yourself, also introduce yourself? I forgot to ask you about.
My name is Thomas Luuk. I'm a practitioner and teacher of European law.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman behind you, please.
Yes, many thanks. I'm Arthur Leichthammer of the Joint Law Center. And this is more of a direct question to Luuk. I read your paper with great interest. I've been thinking about how to perhaps institutionally change the setup a bit more. But I have a few challenges or outstanding questions, perhaps, because you elaborated more on the scope and including dossiers ranging from deforestation to DSA, DMA, onto trade policy and digital regulation. Would it not, like, where does it stop? And like, would you not then at this point have to include most of it? And wouldn't this make this burdensome or cumbersome if it all goes through the same body? And then in the same level, I'm just not quite sure on locating it in the European Council, which is so based on the premise of unanimity, that like in those areas where the Commission or the EU has some capacity that you would take, let's take trade. If you then revert it back to a rather unanimous decision-making body, wouldn't it actually lose decision-making power in certain areas? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then our colleague.
Thank you very much. Yeah, my name is Abdullah Fahimi. I work here at the Center for Climate and Foreign Policy here at the German Council on Foreign Relations. I think you've got a lot of questions on your very interesting proposal. I will ask something about the economic security as the topic. So over the past decade or so, we've seen 3 major developments or trends which led Europe to think about its over-reliance when it comes to security, economic security, hard security, and also the reliance on gas imports. So the war in Ukraine, war in Europe, and the change of administration in the US and the rise of China. So these 3, rise of China and its export controls and all of those. So these 3 developments have led Europe to think it should rely less on other countries. My question is that over the past weeks and months in the negotiation with the US about tariffs and the trade and everything, now this negotiation and the agreement involves Europe buying around 700 billion euro worth of gas from the US. Is this not really replacing one over-reliance with another? I'm also asking this because I work on climate, and well, this is another gas that comes from another major exporter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Luuk, you want to start again, since most of the questions are the first directed to you?
Sure. First, the question from about the European Commission already having or taking up a lot of work, let's say, in the field of security. Well, that is all very well, but if we zoom out at the treaty, which you know maybe better than I do, of course, the security competence of the Commission per se is relatively limited. That is something really dealt with by the member states jointly in the Council and the European Council. So that's basically also the basic conundrum, and it also links to the question of the gentleman behind you, that you have trade on the one hand, where the Commission with the Council and but more the ministries is in the lead, and security and economic security, you have to bring them together one way or another. And that may create complications also for decision-making procedures, as the gentleman, let's say, in red mentioned. But not you. The same is true if you go to the other side, because then you bring security dimensions which are supposed to be, and that's what the member states signed up for. With unanimity, you bring them under a majority rule. But sorry, I'm digressing now. I should go back to what you asked about the Commission. Well, I'm going to take one example. There's a Commissioner for Defense. But that is pure semantic confusion. The Commission has zero competence for defense in the sense of hard security. The Commissioner for Defense should have been called Commissioner for Defense Industry. That is where the Commission has very important work to do. The Commissioner for Trade, which function which has existed for decades, indeed, is now called the Commissioner for Trade and Economic Security. And it's, of course, welcome that this mindset is reflected, but it also begs the question. You cannot just change the title. It doesn't change the mindset in one go. So that is why we think that the Council, which is where the member states jointly gather in an interaction with the Commission, would be a place to discuss these matters. And I understand that for the average newspaper reader, that is complicated, but that does not change the fact that it is important that there is also ownership by ministers and presidents and prime ministers for these kind of economic security decisions that will be taken. Because maybe, and then I'll stop, but I think I do miss a little bit the urgency here. I mean, frankly, it's going to get very rough in the years ahead. The Chinese are going to strangle us with all kinds of export controls over rare earth. The Trump administration is weaponizing everything. Climate policy, by the way, as well. You mentioned energy. I fully agree. We're going to be trapped by that. So we have to equip ourselves one way or another better, or we're just going to be eaten alive. And it has already started. And I know some of this will take time, but well, let's start that. If we do nothing, then we just sit back and wait for the other powers to plunder our economies, and I think that is just not an answer. So we need to do something, and the question is, where can we mobilize enough energy and coherence to make a start with that?
Thank you very much. And with this sort of, I would like to give the rest of the panel also a chance to come in and maybe address the one point that Luuk finished on, sort of how do the European Union, how does the European Union survive in this new age of economic statecraft, where, as Luuk just said, we are in the danger of being eaten alive. Mr. Rentschler.
Yeah, I would still believe that, yes, we all agree on the need to be able to act quickly, but I'm not sure that what you propose is giving us this extra, let's say, agility, because ultimately it will be about our instruments, and the instruments have certain rules. You know, the anti-coercion instrument has a different trigger than the trade enforcement regulation, which has, again, a different one than maybe adopting trade agreements, and all of these are needed. And this is a bit the question also from the colleague from the Delors Institute, where does it stop? Because if you take economic security serious, and if you look also at the respective papers, it's everything from protect, which is now in the first place what we think about when you think of China, to partner, to diversify, to use that kind of, to promote, to, let's say, finish and let's say, deepen the internal market. You need every player around. You know, if you want to, you have to define the mandate of what we're actually talking about. So if you look at the case by case, I would still believe that the setup is there. The sense of urgency may not be there, but that's something of agenda setting, you know, put the European Council in a maybe more regular rhythm, set the agenda properly, define the strategy, then the Coreper with all its workload has to focus on those things, and it can take decisions. I mean, I can't see if it's about, you know, being able to act quickly, how what you propose is the decision making quicker. What would be a solution? And this is when I speak about looking at instruments, it is about QMV also in other areas. That's another story, you know, then we're talking. But under the current rules, and every instrument has its rules, I think this putting them together in a kind of different setting is not really the answer to the question, to the problem that I fully agree is there.
Thank you very much. Katharina.
Thank you. Maybe just touching upon, Luuk, you mentioned urgency. I think we completely agree. I think every single time we open up our phones, it feels like there's new export controls from China or new tariffs from the US, or then there's the 50% rule of the US, and then there's cases like Nexperia, and it's going on and on and on. So I think we all understand the need for urgency, just because we're being caught between these this trade and technology conflict right now. And but maybe my question is also maybe going back to the question that was also here in the room, and which I didn't find in the paper, is how or would decisions actually be formed in an Economic Security Council, and if so, would that be anonymously, you know, in unity, not anonymously, in unity? Just because, and again, touching upon, you know, the 19th sanctions package, which I think a month ago was about to come, and I think every single day we're waiting. Will it come? No. Are we waiting? Oh, no. And this is also based because there's disagreements and it's troublesome to actually find, like I said, that one common denominator. And maybe also, Luuk, you can maybe touch upon how that would also be secured, that matter of urgency, through the council.
Thank you very much. Before we go to Luuk, I think maybe Filip with some final remarks also.
Yes, I'm gonna offer my final 2 cents on this, kind of the way that I understood it. Maybe is rather not so much and maybe that's wrong, not so much about decision making, but about fostering the strategic thinking, in the sense that if there is kind of this collective thinking about matters which are actually also kind of on security matters, which need also a certain level of secrecy, does this foster kind of a more European strategizing from member states together with the European Union institutions? Little bit coming from this perspective that what we're seeing in the current Commission is we're having DG Trade and Economic Security, which is now dealing with economic security, and we have DG Grow, which is dealing with industrial strategy. We have other DGs which are kind of taking up other parts where we somehow need to bring them together, because otherwise we can't get in the other pillars. And this is, in the end, bringing up questions which are sometimes more about those mentioned trade-offs of deliberations, and not so much only about taking decisions about activating the ACI, which I think is anyways something which is only going to happen if it happens. And if it happens, we're going to know that it's going to happen, because by then there's going to have flown so much water down the Rhine, if how they say, that it's going to be clear. So I don't think this is so much about the necessity of new forms of decision making, although I would be agreeing, yes, on certain matters of security, definitely, and QMV, but that's more about the strategy about that we need for a geoeconomic age. I think something which is within the council, where you need agency and you bring by this also certain kind of legitimacy, does help, at least with the mindset and the understanding.
Thanks so much. Luuk, is there sort of unanimity? Is that sort of...
No, I can pick up on these last two comments by Filip. And going back to the structure, which I described very briefly at the beginning. So you have the level of leaders, ambassadors, and the working level of the national coordinators for economic security. And starting at that working level, that's exactly where a common strategic culture could be and would be fostered ideally, because from 27 EU capitals, ideally, let's say in Germany, from the Nationalen Sicherheitsrat, there would be one high-level person who works directly with the highest political body, sitting there maybe twice per month, talking to 26 others. And some member states already have these bodies in place, like Denmark. Others still need to build them. And so if we say, okay, we need that kind of task force or body, it will also encourage and stimulate member states who are now just waiting to also invest in these kind of economic security cross-cutting decisions. So that's at the working level, and that is alerting, basically, fostering that strategic mindset. With having a good information position as well, with all the policy making that is being done, providing that foreign policy assessment. Now, and then the two levels up, I'm going to take them together. There you get closer to decision making, where the leaders act as decision makers in last resort, and the ambassadors prepare these decisions. So there you are talking about unanimity, but there you are really talking about the most high-profile decisions, like the EU-US, like Russia sanctions, indeed. So I think these two roles of alerting on the one hand and steering and deciding on the other hand, they should be distinguished according to the level. And as mentioned at the beginning, a lot of that is already in place, because there is a European Council, which you could ask a few extra persons to attend such meetings, as also happened in other more informal bodies like the Euro summits. The weekly meeting of ambassadors, co-repair 2 in local parliament, is already in place, and there also you could just add a few persons and maybe have a different chair. And the renewal really is to have that dedicated task force plus a person. And when that works, and when 27 national coordinators would also come, then that body could develop a political authority of its own, and it would have to be taken seriously. But of course that is only practice can show. And just to be clear as a final thought, I don't care if somebody else has something else which works better. That's perfect. I just think that the status quo is irresponsible, and that we need to do something which provides at the same time the expertise, which avoids the kind of diplomatic damage, and which also has, in the long run, a kind of democratic legitimacy for decisions which will be ever more important and substantial, will basically affect people's daily lives and the standard of living, and well, if you have if these criteria are fulfilled, maybe something else comes out of it. But this is just one proposal, and it at least cuts us into a conversation this evening.
Thank you, Roos. And this is what IPQ debates are really about. So sort of to push this issue and get engagement for an issue which is, as Luuk says, very urgent, but not so easy sometimes. So thank you all for being here with us tonight, for finding your way to the German Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you also for those who've watched us via Zoom. Thank you for your attention. We now here in the room have in the lucky position to be able to have a drink now to celebrate 5 years of IPQ and to toast again to our panelists. But I will all encourage you to join me in thanking for their contributions this evening. Thank you all very much. Thank you.